Alright guys, what is up and welcome to the 35th episode of Train Turns Talk Show. And today we're doing a special one once more. We are doing steam locomotives. I've never, in the entire 2 years of this series existing, I've never talked about a single steam locomotive. I don't even know if I've mentioned a steam locomotive. The reason why is because I just didn't know anything about them, but recently I've been finally starting to study more about steam engines. There is my cat back there. And today I'm finally going to tell you some more things about steam engines. We're going to be going over like how they're classified and other interesting things about them. I'll tell some interesting facts and everything. So let's get started. Alright, so this here is the first ever steam locomotive that was invented in 1802 by Richard Trevithick. I probably did not pronounce that last name right. And this steam engine that Richard had made was nicknamed the Coal-Brookdale. Steam locomotives were around in the 1800s. However, though, the first public steam railway wasn't made until 1829, and in 1825 George Stephenson, known as the father of railways, had built the locomotion for the Stockton and Darlington Railway. Then he built the rocket, which was entered and won in the Rainhill Trials. Now, the Rainhill Trials, it was a competition that lasted from October 6th all the way to October 14th of 1829 to test George Stephenson's argument that locomotives would provide the best motive power for the then nearly completed Liverpool and Manchester Railway, which was opened in 1830, making exclusive use of steam power for both passenger and freight trains. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway was also the first ever intercity railroad. Alright, well guys, let's go ahead and take a look at how steam locomotives are classified. Now that you know a little backstory on the steam locomotives, let's go ahead and take a look at how they're classified. Well, they're classified by something called the Whyte notation. And these steam locomotives are classified by wheel arrangement, almost similar to how we talked about the AAR wheel arrangements on diesel locomotives. But these classifications of steam locomotives are super easy. They are classified by numbers and by the wheels. So let's go ahead and take a look. Alright, so this is IC 2500 on display in Centralia, Illinois. And this locomotive here is a 482 steam engine. Now, how did they come up with that? Well, let's look at the wheels first of all. These two wheels up in the front are the leading wheels. These bigger wheels in the middle are the driving wheels, and these two in the very back are the trailing wheels. Now, let's see how they came up with that name, the 482. Well, as I said, it's by the wheels, and depending on how many wheels there are, there's usually 3 to 4 numbers in the classification. And there is a hyphen separating them, like this. This is what a 482 steam locomotive would look like written down. But anyways, so how do they come up with that name? Well, there's 4 leading wheels, 8 driving wheels, and 2 trailing wheels. So therefore, this is a 482 steam locomotive, and it's written down just like this. And there you go. That's how they classify steam locomotives. It's super easy. Now there are some other steam locomotives that can have 0 leading wheels and 0 trailing wheels and just 4 driving wheels. And this one, for example, the one that I showed you earlier that was built in 1802, well, there's actually a name for that engine using the Whyte notation, and it is a 040 steam locomotive from 1802. And then in the 1820s, Timothy Hackworth came out with a variant of that steam locomotive, but this time it has 6 driving wheels, but also 0 front wheels and 0 trailing wheels. So this engine is called a 060 steam locomotive. At the time that this locomotive was used a lot, the 060 configuration was the most widely used wheel arrangement for both tender and tank steam locomotives. These engines were strong for their size, but on the other hand, there was a lack of unpowered leading wheels, which had the result of 060 locomotives being less stable at speeds. So these engines were mostly used on trains where high speed was not needed. Now take a look at this engine. It has a tender cab this time. And as we all know, most steam locomotives were ran off of coal. And this was the coal tender. And there would be coal in there to get the steam locomotive to run, as you all know. And this here, as you can see, has 8 driving wheels, but once more, 0 trailing or 0 leading wheels. So this is a 080 steam locomotive. Now here's an oddball right here. This engine is very interesting. Look how tiny that coal tender is. Wow. This is a very interesting steam locomotive here, and this time it actually has leading wheels and a set of trailing wheels. This locomotive here is called the 242, and this was made by the Baldwin Locomotive Works. And the wheel arrangement was widely used on passenger tank locomotives during the last 3 decades of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th century. And the majority of 242 locomotives were tank engines, which were designated as 242T, the T standing for tank. Now, tank engines are a little different from tender engines. Tank engines are locomotives that carry water in one or more onboard water tanks. Instead of a more traditional tender, most tank engines have bunkers, aka fuel tanks, to hold fuel. In a tender tank locomotive, a tender holds some or all of the fuel and may hold some water as well. Now, when classifying steam locomotives, there's not really very many numbers that they use, and usually there's only 3 numbers on when being classified, and sometimes it can go up to 4 when the engine is bigger. But for numbers that they usually only use 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, and sometimes even 10. Because the steam locomotive with all its wheels are always even numbered on each section. These 2 up front, these 6 up front, and then those 2 in the very back. But this locomotive here is a 262. So those right there are just some examples of some steam locomotives and how they are classified. I would go over the rest, but if I did, this would be an insanely long episode. There are a ton of them. So instead, I'm just going to show you a list of the rest of the steam locomotives. But don't worry, we will be talking about the other famous ones like the Queen of Steam, the Big Boy, of course, the Challenger, and the Living Legend, 844. We'll be talking about those as well. I would talk about the rest of the other steam locomotives made, but there are so many of them that this episode would be crazy long if I did them all. So, for now, here is a list of other steam locomotive classifications, and you can look up pictures of them too. Alright, so, before I tell you some interesting facts about steam engines, we of course have to talk about some of the most famous steam engines. This, you should all know what this is. The good old Union Pacific Big Boy, or UP 4014. There are other big boy locomotives. For example, UP 4006 on display at the St. Louis Museum of Transportation. That's also a big boy. It's just not in service. 4014 is the only steam locomotive that is in service on the Union Pacific. Now you're probably wondering, how could this train lead if all locomotives are required with positive train control? Well, they say that UP 4014 has positive train control, but in reality, it doesn't. It actually comes from the Union Pacific SD70M 4015. That's how UP 4014 gets its PTC. And that's why that SD70M was placed in the middle of the Union Pacific OCS. But Union Pacific 4014 is a 4884 steam locomotive via the wheels. Look at the size of this beast. And some interesting facts about this engine. This engine was built in 1941, the same year that the Polar Express locomotive was built. And not only that, the Union Pacific Big Boy weighs 1.2 million pounds. That is more than double the weight of an SD70 ACE, which only weighs 420,000 pounds. Alright, and now let's talk about UP 3985. It's similar to the Big Boy, but it's not quite the Big Boy. It's pretty much like Big Boy's little brother. We will put it like that. UP 3985, nicknamed the Challenger. Now then, there are some differences in this. The Union Pacific Big Boy is a 4884 steam locomotive, while the Challenger is only a 4664 steam locomotive. The Challenger has a little bit less wheels placed on there, and there are also some other outside differences. Here's a side comparison right here. And now here's a really cool looking engine. This is a streamlined steam engine, and this is Norfolk and Western's 611, also known as the Spirit of Roanoke and the Queen of Steam. It is a preserved Norfolk and Western 484 Northern streamlined steam locomotive. This engine was built in May of 1950 by the East End Shops in Roanoke, Virginia. And now look at this one. This is a smaller version of the Union Pacific Big Boy, pretty much. Instead of a 4884, this is a 2882 steam locomotive. Norfolk and Western 2156. And this engine is currently on display in St. Louis at the Museum of Transportation. And I only live an hour away from St. Louis, so I may have to check this out. And then here we are for the final steam locomotive that we're talking about in today's episode. As I said, I would talk about the rest of them, but there are just so many of them out there, and it would just be way too long of an episode and way too much of a mess. But anyways, this is also one of my favorite steam engines. This is a unique looking locomotive, UP 844, also known as the Living Legend. This is a 484 steam locomotive. Oh, and UP 844 actually used to be in a different paint scheme back then. It used to have gray on it. Oh, and ever wondered what the Polar Express was? Well, it's actually a Lima 284 steam locomotive, if you're ever wondering what that was based on. Alright guys, well that is it for today's Train Terms Talk Show episode 35. And I hope you enjoyed this special talking about steam locomotives for once instead of diesel locomotives or train symbols. So, coming up next, we will be talking about the Heron Railroad. Requested. Stay tuned.